Welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast. Today, I'm speaking to Associate Professor at Australian Catholic University, Stu Cormack. Thanks for tuning in to episode 293 of the Pacey Performance Podcast. So absolutely delighted to get Stu on for this episode today. He's been on the list for a long time and definitely one who I've stalked probably more than I should have done over the last 3 or 4 years, but delighted to get him on finally. So he's done some amazing work over the last 20-25 years in the industry, more recently at ACU. So if you haven't checked out his research, definitely do. But this episode complements Matt Varley's episode from a couple of weeks ago really well. We discussed sports tech and Stu's journey through sports tech. Then we discussed GPS, the rise of inertial sensors, internal validation, how it's done, why it's so important to do, which is the link to Matt's episode. Then we discussed the integration of sports science and strength and conditioning, which is a really interesting topic. Then we finally have a little chat around load and the fatigue relationship, which again is a huge part of Stu's current research and previous research. So it's really good to get his take on that topic. So it's a great episode. If you're into your load monitoring, this is definitely one for you. But if you haven't checked out Matt Varley's episode, whether you do this one before Matt's or Matt's before this, I do really think they complement each other really nicely. So I hope you enjoy the chat with Stu. Would love your feedback, and I will chat to you soon. This episode of the Pacey Performance Podcast is sponsored by Kitman Labs. So Kitman Labs partners with leading sports teams to help them consistently achieve the highest levels of performance by increasing the impact of their data. So over 200 teams across the globe rely on Kitman Labs' performance intelligence platform to quantify the cost of performance and injury and receive the right insights at the right time. Through unique outcome-driven analytics and the most advanced athlete management system, teams can align their organizations around a shared view of what it takes to drive performance and health and move at the speed of sport to adjust and continuously improve. If you want to know more about Kitman Labs, head over to www.win.kitmanlabs.com/impact. This episode of the Pacey Performance Podcast is sponsored by iMeasureU. So used by leading sports practitioners and biomechanics researchers worldwide to capture and compare multi-limb inertial data in the field, IMU Step from iMeasureU is a dual sensor and app lower limb load monitoring tool which helps practitioners optimize return to play for running-based sports. So iMeasureU have just released their new and improved waterproof sensor Blue Trident, which includes ultra-high G capabilities to quantify high-impact steps such as cutting, landing and sprinting, longer battery life to collect data all day, real-time feedback to aid immediate interventions, and faster workflow so practitioners can review long training sessions within minutes of training completion. iMeasureU, now part of Vicon, works with military, pro and collegiate coaches and athletes from around the world, including the Australian Institute of Sport, US Department of Defence and collegiate and pro teams from around the world. If you want to get to know more about iMeasureU, head over to their website iMeasureU.com or follow them on Twitter or Instagram at iMeasureU. So without further ado, over to the episode with Stu Cormack. Thanks for tuning into the Pacey Performance Podcast. So this morning or this evening, I'm delighted to welcome Stu Cormack. So welcome to the podcast, mate.
Good morning, Rob. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming on. So the two things that I fear the most with this podcast is, well, there's three actually, I lied earlier. One is getting the surname wrong, but in this instance, I'm pretty sure I can handle a Cormack.
I think
the second one is job title. So I always dodge that because I don't know, that can always cause a bit of an issue. And the third one is time zones, and that's where I failed a few weeks ago, so apologies for that. This should have been probably out by now, but my bad on that one.
Not to worry.
Yeah, thanks, mate. Thanks for bearing with me. So anyone that doesn't know who you are, just want to give us a bit of a background on yourself, what you're doing at ACU, what you've done previously, and then we'll jump off from there.
Yeah, sure. Look, I'm sure there's a lot of people who don't know me or anything about me, but I guess my current role is Associate Professor in the School of Behavioural and Health Science at ACU. My role there is across a couple of areas. I'm heavily involved in our online Master of High Performance Sport, which a few people know about, and also a whole lot of applied research. But in addition to that, part of my work is to provide consultancy services to different programs that kind of engage ACU, and I do the work on behalf of ACU to support those programs. For example, Australian Institute of Sport Combat Sports Centre. I've just recently finished a role with the International Cricket Council, and I've had some consultancy work with an AFL football club as part of my ACU role. But been there now for I think it's 8 years, so moving fairly quickly. But of course, prior to that, a long time in high performance sport.
Excellent. What did you do before ACU? What was the previous? What was the job previous to that?
Yeah, gee. Sadly, people will be able to tell by the greyness of my beard that I've been around a while. And so because of that, there's a few jobs prior to ACU. I probably started out like most people and, did some time volunteering in sport. And then my first sort of major gig in sport was I worked for an AFL team when it was all part-time back in Melbourne. And I was actually teaching physical education at the time, back in the day before these roles were full-time. So, again, the age is sort of coming out. So I was sort of teaching to support my coaching habit, for want of a better analogy. And then started that in, believe it or not, 1994. And then after that, I went and worked at the AIS in Canberra. Was lucky enough to be there in the 4-year cycle of the lead up to the Sydney Olympic Games. So,
wow.
Yeah, it was just a great experience that had a huge impact on sort of forming my approach to high performance sport. After that, went to the West Coast Eagles Football Club in Perth, and lucky enough to spend 8 years there where we were pretty successful. Then moved back to my hometown of Melbourne to work with another AFL club, just to be closer to family, etc. And then, when that all came to an end, as they tend to at some point in high performance sport, I made the move to ACU, so crossed that sort of boundary from being a high performance practitioner with an interest in the applied research to sort of now shifting the balance, a bit more towards the applied research, but still the huge interest in the high performance sport at the coalface whenever the opportunity arises.
Mm-hmm. So it was Glen Stewart at West Coast Eagles.
Yeah, so
okay. Are you still there?
Yeah. In fact, we just were in contact a couple of days ago. So still very close friends with Glen. We shared an office for 8 years. So really good mates and just a class operator.
Mm-hmm. When you do speak to them people, as you clearly do, and they have the background and been in that environment for 25 years,
yep.
Just to have that longevity in that stressful environment, in that unstable environment, fair play. Like it's a long old stint.
Oh, and
Very
particularly,
of that.
Look, it is, and particularly in Glen's example, he's been at the one club.
Yes.
It's not even multiple clubs for that length of time. I've been in, I think, 27 years of high performance sport I've been involved now, but I certainly haven't been in the one environment that long. So, look, as we all know, it can chew you up and spit you out pretty quickly. So to survive for that long is very impressive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you mentioned your agent talking about physical education teacher, but there's been quite a few that have been on who have come through that kind of background. I know you've probably transitioned back into that because you're doing your stuff at the university now. But how much of a good grounding did that physical education background give you moving forward into high performance sport and then obviously back into your current role?
Massive. I couldn't overstate how important that was. I was talking to someone the other day. We walked in, I remember, to day one of our degree program, and it was quite a selective degree. There was quite a few hurdles to actually get in. And I remember day one we walked in, they divided us into groups, and then they gave us a skill that we had to go and teach someone. Day one, we didn't know anybody's name. We didn't know anything. Go and teach this. Well, I don't know how to do that. Well, they knew we didn't know how to do it, but that wasn't the point. And so you learnt very, very quickly, how to develop the skills to organise a group, ensure that the teaching points were appropriate. Some of those basic things that are important to teachers that then transferred to coaching high-performance athletes. It was a huge factor in allowing me to do that. I think maybe a little more successfully early on than I otherwise would have.
Mm-hmm. I know this isn't on the list of discussion points, but I think given the situation, it'd be quite nice to have a little chat about the online program that you guys run at ACU. Do you think that will? I know it's already popular, but do you think that'll allow it become more popular given the times that we're living in, and obviously at the back end of this?
Yeah, it's a good question, Rob. Look, it is relatively popular, and I must say there's some other really good programs around that offer education around high performance sport in similar or sometimes slightly different ways. But I think it's going to have a big impact on the way we deliver tertiary education. I think it's forced people to be innovative with the way they deliver. People are very quickly upskilling in how to deliver content online. And as a result of that, I think we'll see lots more people understand that that's a really viable option for them, both from universities delivering and people actually obtaining their education that way. So I think it's going to hasten the advance towards online education.
Yeah, absolutely agree. So one thing that I'm really interested in, and I know you are, is the sports technology side of it. And we're going to get into a bit of a discussion around GPS and all these kind of all the good stuff. But where did you get interested in sports tech, and why did, I suppose, your research kind of go down that way? Was it influenced from obviously your practical days, and then where did that come from?
Yeah, look, for me, every bit of research I've ever done has been driven by a practical interest. So even the stuff that we do that might be considered perhaps a little more mechanistic, for me that's of interest because you can then make the leaps or the steps towards the practical implication. So that's always been the driver. But the tech stuff started, and I must bring up Glen Stewart again. We started with this in, it'd be 2000 or 2001. And I can remember distinctly being out in the middle of the Subiaco Oval, which was the home ground of the West Coast Eagles in Perth, Australia. And Glenn was up in the grandstand, and he had a little tablet, so that was designed to track with an electronic pen the movement pattern of the players on the ground. And we were trialling that, and we went to the point ultimately where we had a handful of them, and we had a bunch of students that were collecting game day activity profile with that method.
So each student had a player to watch? Oh,
yeah.
Wowza.
Yeah, so it was labour intensive, but, we went out there, we measured the distance, and then we tracked the distance, so we did our own little internal validation and calibration of the tech to understand the data that it was giving us. Now, we soon moved, as soon as we could, to GPS, and we bought 1 unit of 1 hertz GPS, 1 hertz. And again, we went out and we played with it, and we had some runs through Perth that we went on regularly. And I remember I threw it on my back the first day, and right, off we go, see what it tells us. And we developed, our interest in that, at the time, the AFL then brought in a rule that you could have a maximum of 10 units because they were worried about inequity across the competition. So as a club, we pushed that. We got the I think we had 8 or 10, and got the data off players at training and matches, and that was probably the start of it from a tracking perspective. But at the time I was at West Coast, I'd just around that time started thinking about further study, and then as a couple of years went past, I connected with Professor Rob Newton from Edith Cowan University and Professor Mike McGuigan, who's now at Auckland University of Technology. They supervised my PhD, and that's where my interest came in with regards to force plates, linear position transducers, etc. So that was the first real concrete use of it. When I was at the AIS, I did a research master's, and I used a force plate that was embedded in the floor in the physiology lab, and you had to go back through individual lines of code and output to find the point to identify the phase of the jump or the peak or whatever. So that's kind of where it all kicked off.
Mm-hmm. Am I right in thinking that you were probably the first guys to be exposed to GPS on the back of the Olympics?
Yeah, so timing's everything, and geez, I've been so lucky. When I was at the AIS between 97 and 2000, that was the period when there was a microtechnology grant between the Australian government's sort of scientific arm, which is called the Commonwealth Scientific Industrial Research Organisation. And there was a grant and a link between the AIS and the CSIRO to develop microtechnology. And that product was the forerunner of what we now know as Catapult.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Yeah.
So when it was coming out, and it was the 1 hertz unit. Obviously, we look back now, as we do with, I don't know, the old iPhone and going back further, like black and white. But did you realise and I suppose contemplate at the time that this was going to really kick on the way it has done? Did you knew it was the infancy of something that was going to be really influential in what sports scientists do?
Yeah, it's interesting to think back. At the time, I can remember just being fascinated by what this could tell us. And I remember, having discussions thinking, wow, if we can really understand the external load of the athlete, the activity profile, what a huge advantage that is for designing training and monitoring, how athletes are coping. So I was really excited, and quickly things were developing with the software, and you knew it was going to happen fast. But I'd have to be honest, I don't think I perceived at the time the huge role it would play in in world sport.
Mm-hmm. So fast forwarding to where we are now, where do you think we are now in terms of using GPS and player tracking?
Well, this might be a bit controversial. In some cases, I think the tail started to wag the dog. So what I mean by that is I think sometimes we've got so excited by what this technology tells us that we've forgotten that it's for the purpose of maximising performance, and that it's not a performance criteria in itself. And so we've got caught up in all these thousands of variations of metrics and what have you, but they're not all that useful. Some of them can tell you some really interesting stuff that's really valuable, but some of the numbers are a bit black box historically, and even if they're really accurate in reflecting what they purport to measure. That's maybe not that important to the outcome, to what the athlete does or achieves. But having said that, I'm starting to feel a shift back. I reckon we accelerated up to the point where we just collected everything and we thought it was all important. And now we're starting to reassess and say, oh, hang on a minute. How are we actually using this technology to drive our practice or to inform our coaching decisions? Rather than, as I say, for a little while there, I think it got to the point where it was driving the programs rather than, helping us make good decisions.
Do you think there was a certain turning point, or do you think it's just a natural progression of a trend, I guess? Or do you think yeah.
Yeah, it was probably a natural progression. But I think one of the things that helped there is that as for want of a better word, scrutiny on devices and technology increased, that's resulted in a little bit more in-depth analysis of, okay, well, what does that mean? What is it telling us? How is it helping us? And I say that from both a research perspective and, at the coalface application perspective. So we've become a little bit more clever in how we use it. So it's probably a natural evolution, but I do believe that, the sports science research process has actually helped that.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned about the 1,000 different metrics and people actually collecting everything, and then now we're at a point of actually trying to maybe reduce that and actually pick out the ones that are useful. How do we go through that process? How do practitioners go through that process of actually collecting what is meaningful to them?
Look, it's not easy, and again, I think this is where, in some ways, some of the applied research has been really helpful, because it's perhaps utilised, some statistical approaches, some larger data sets, some work that's able to be really objective and help us decide, well, like instinctively this variable sounds like it would be important, but actually when we analyse it, it doesn't really mean much at all. So I think that's probably the way. It's to have some kind of objective process to examine the interactions between what you can measure and decide whether that's actually important. Does it impact the individual athlete's performance, the game outcome? Does it have a role to play in the fatigue response that we might see post performance? And I think people are starting to understand that if it just happens, but it's sort of inconsequential, we can probably push it to the side.
And I refer back to the UKSCA conference presentations quite a bit, because quite a few of the people I've had on have presented the UKSCA, and I've rewatched their presentations prior to jumping on. And just thinking back to yours, you presented some work. I think it was around RSI, potentially back in 2000. Jump data.
Yeah, flight time and contraction time, which was
that's the one
from my PhD research.
Yeah. So you how you presented that and what you presented was exactly that, going through the process of deciphering what was useful and what wasn't. In terms of that exact process from a practitioner point of view, and we've got it on the list of I suppose internal validation. It comes back to what you were doing on the tablets back in early 2000s. Obviously things have slightly moved on since then, but I guess that the process is still very similar in terms of how we actually get to know what we should be collecting and what is actually meaningful. So from a practitioner point of view, I know it's Friday today, but on Monday, if the world was in a normal state, how can people go through that process to understand what they're collecting is what they think they are? and what is useful to them?
Yeah, well, look, it's one of those things that it kind of underpins in my mind, any of the decisions about the usability of the technology and the variables that come out of it. So I think there's a couple of steps. The first one, is really the question around validity. So is the technology and the variable measuring what it purports to measure? And I've got to say that with the increased scrutiny of things like microtechnology for measuring, external load, speed, distance, accelerometer, load, and similar variables, I think we can actually be more and more confident that those variables actually represent what the companies say they represent. Because, back in the day, the company could say, well, this is 5 metres a second, and you go, okay.
Must be.
Must be.
Yeah.
But now, they don't do that because they know full well somebody's going to grab that tech and run a reliability and validity study on it straight away. So, I'm much more confident now about the validity and reliability of the technology. Having said that, I don't think any of us should just take it for granted. We shouldn't just accept, that's the number. So, some simple things like, saying, well, if I want to buy the units, I want to trial them for a week and go out and do a test. And when you've got a known distance and it's a bit different, you question why. Is that filtering? Is it something else? Run a little reliability trial in your program. So you get people to run the same course a number of times and see how consistent that data is. It's not onerous, but I think it can give you some real confidence that what you're investing probably a fairly large amount of money in is actually giving you what you expect. And I don't think you should have any qualms at all about comparing one brand of tech straight up against another brand. Put them both on your back and see whether you get the same number. And if not, I think you should quite rightly expect a good explanation as to why that's the case from the company.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, from my experience in this world, on the other side of it, on the non-practitioner side of it, you'd be surprised how well. I don't think you probably would be surprised, but people may be surprised how few people actually do that. And these companies will have double pouch vests, triple valve vests,
absolutely.
pouch vests to be able to do this kind of thing. But very rarely would people do it. Very rarely would people come to the end of their 2-year contract, 3-year contract, and actually consider anything else. It's just a given that it kind of almost a given that it rolls over, which is quite worrying.
Yeah, it is. But, it's funny. You can understand the pressure on people, from a whole lot of angles as to why 100%. That's the case. But I just think, we can probably take some steps that are relatively simple. The other thing is that because the scrutiny is so much higher, you can probably find a pretty recent research paper which will give you the validity reliability numbers on, technology X and variable 1. It'll be out there. So that's the other part of it for me is do a little bit of work and sift through the research to find out whether the questions you have about the tech have actually been answered in a bit more of a tighter manner, for want of a better term.
Yeah, I mean, just on that and the time that it would take to do something really reasonably comprehensive in your own environment to go through this, whether it's comparing X to Y to Z in terms of the different companies, is it worth it given that the data that can be generated can be different from environment to environment, from stadium to stadium? Is it worth going through that, or do you think it is okay to kind of look into the research, or do we need to do both?
Look, I think in an ideal world you do both, but I'm realistic enough to know that it's not with either it's not in the realms of time or even sometimes expertise for people to do that with in their own environment. So if they can't, I accept that completely. But what I would do is then make sure that I was really confident that I'd explored, the published work that examined that technology to be comfortable that I was putting my money on something that was in fact valid and reliable. And then, of course, there's a second step of, just because the metric's valid and reliable, is it meaningful? And so you can buy the best tech in the world, but if you're not using it in a way that's, appropriate to kind of inform your practice, well, that's a step that you probably really have to get right.
Mm-hmm. Just going back to the early 2000s pre-2000 when you were using the first 1 Hertz unit, were they just GPS or was there any other inertial sensors in there? No.
I'll be honest, if there was, we only looked at the GPS.
Yeah.
So we were looking at plain speed and distance metrics. So that would have been early 2000s, very early 2000s, and that was the forerunner of, or the company was GP Sports, which
yes.
you'd be familiar with. Yeah, so that was their first 1 Hertz unit. So quite interesting that Catapult and GP Sports both came out of Australia.
Mm-hmm. So just moving on to the present day and I suppose the rise of inertial sensors and companies doing solely inertial sensors rather than combining that with the GPS device. Where can that potentially head, do you think, in terms of the future of inertial sensors and the use of that to actually become meaningful alongside the GPS metrics?
Look, it's a fantastic point. We've actually got a PhD project at the moment that's looking at some of those issues. We've already done quite a bit of work that's utilised the accelerometers, as opposed to looking at GPS metrics such as speed and distance. My personal view is that I think that is where the greatest insight is going to lie, because speed and distance are what I'd call relatively blunt metrics. They tend to be maintained relatively well. They're fairly easy to measure. They're pretty accurate. But these inertial sensors, they have a high sample rate. They tend to be very reliable. And, in theory, depending on placement and some, mathematical calculations, there's a potential to calculate some much more discrete representations of movement strategy, and to me that's where we're likely to find some real gems that provide us with information about the status of our athlete and how they're performing.
I guess because of that depth and because of that, like you say, high sample rate, that can potentially lead to people being quite daunted, I guess, with the amount of data that them kind of devices are going to churn out. How big a problem is that? And I guess is it just the evolution of the cycle that people gravitate towards that as people become more au fait with dealing with large sets of data?
Possibly. I think, like everything, people will develop, more user-friendly approaches to deal with that. Technology companies will start to automate more of the output that comes from those sensors, which of course comes with the challenge of us understanding exactly, how those automated outputs are derived. But, you look at companies now, the GPS companies all have some version of, player load or body load or similar, which is a derived metric from the accelerometer, and that's that's easily understood by pretty much everybody as a global representation of external load. You can drill down a little bit further and start to look at perhaps the individual vectors or, the contribution or the value of those variables at, certain velocity bands, etc. And then you've got companies like IMU who produce, the IMU step and the new Trident sensors, which, on an iPad is giving you a whole lot of information about some quite discrete stride parameters. So, I think like all things, it's going to evolve and become more and more user-friendly as it's commercialised.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So we're just going to take a very, very quick break in the chat with Stu. Hope you're enjoying part 1. So over in part 2, we discuss more on the sports science and strength and conditioning integration and why that's so important, aligning philosophies and approaches in them 2 areas. Then we finalise the episode with a little bit of a chat around load and fatigue relationship. Now, anyone that knows Stu and his research knows this forms a large part of it. So a really interesting chat to get it from the horse's mouth towards the end, whether we're talking about neuromuscular fatigue, counter movement jump, submax tests. It's all in there towards the end. So it's something to look forward to because it's a really interesting topic coming from Stu. But just before we do dive into part 2, I want to say a big thanks to Hawking Dynamics for sponsoring this episode today. So Hawking Dynamics offer the world's first wireless Forceplate testing system. So the Hawking Dynamics system is built around what coaches want, so they can test in the real world and not just in the lab. So you're able to capture reliable data on all athletes in a matter of minutes and monitor progress from their cloud-based system from anywhere in the world. So as I've mentioned, the Hawking Dynamics Forceplates are wireless, which means they're portable, and they're also trusted by teams at a number of different levels in a number of different sports. So integrating Forceplates into your athlete monitoring system could not be easier and more affordable. So if you want to get to know a little bit more about Hawking Dynamics or actually see their plates in action, head over to the website, which is hawkingdynamics.com, which you can also schedule a demo, and follow them on Twitter at Hawking Dynamics. And also sponsoring this episode today is Black Box Fitness. So Black Box Fitness are a sports performance equipment manufacturer based in Belfast in Northern Ireland. So if you are looking for a full gym fit out, if you're lucky enough to be looking for a full gym fit out, or just want to add additional pieces to what you've already got, whether that be barbells, dumbbells, plates, maybe a new rack, some flooring, etc., have a little look at what Black Box Fitness can offer. So you can head to their website, which is blkboxfitness.com, or for a more informal view of what they do, head over to their Instagram because they've got some really cool images of some of the recent projects that they've run in Australia, in the UK, in Europe, etc. So head over to their Instagram, which is at blkboxfitness, and they're the same on Twitter. So I want to bring the S&C coach into this conversation now. So we've kind of isolated the sports scientist. I know there's people out there doing dual roles, and I'm guessing that as this current situation progresses, that we may come back to that where sadly people are let go and roles are combined. But just bringing the S&C coach back into this, and in terms of philosophies, how important is it for you for them to, although they may be the same person moving forward and maybe still be now, to align their philosophies in terms of how they go about things?
Well, it's critical, isn't it? I mean, for me, again, I'm showing my age here, but I'm still not quite sure how they ended up completely separate things.
Okay.
Because every S&C coach that I know that's worth their salt is basing their programming on scientific principles. Now, does that make them a sports scientist or an S&C coach? Well, I'm not fussed what you call them. It doesn't matter what you call them. They're using scientific ideas. And, funnily enough, they're conducting N of 1 and small group research projects all the time. That's what they do. But we've probably developed this kind of side of our profession, which is, and it's partly due to all this data that's available and the technology and the measurement and the testing, which, I think is absolutely valuable to enhancing performance. But, it's got to go hand in hand with, day-to-day decision-making and exercise prescription and coaching, or it's not, it exists, but it's kind of this parallel universe. So I think that integration and the same page is critically important. And for me, I think, we've gone from the days of the all-rounder to these very specialised niche roles. And I think, as you say, this current situation might send us back a bit more to the all-rounder. Now, the all-rounder, there'll be some people who have more skills here or here, but they're across everything. And I think where it works best for me is when you remember why you're there. You're there to enhance performance. Now, if you call me now a sports scientist or an S&C coach, well, it probably depends what day of the week. So when I'm working with a PhD student or we're analysing some data, well, maybe I'm a sports scientist. But when I'm in the gym with my combat centre, judo athletes, and I'm loading the bar up on a squat, well, I'm an S&C coach. But I think they've got to be one in the same. But it's funny. I see people sort of sometimes talk about, that research doesn't apply. I'm not sure about that, because it might not be your exact squad or demographic, but even the fact that you can read it and say, yeah, well, that's cool, but it doesn't apply to me. Well, by definition, it kind of does apply, because you've just removed that from being a thing that you have to worry about. But equally, there could be a bit of research that's in a similar sport or has a mechanistic component where you think, oh, gee, that's worth exploring in our environment. I might not copy and paste, because no good programs do that anyway. But I think, quite often it applies more than people give it credit for. But equally, on the other side, we've got to be really careful sometimes in sports science that we just don't head off down a line which is actually never going to drive practice. And I think that can actually happen relatively easily. We can get a little bit academic. So I think we, as the day I must be sports scientist today. I think we've got to be careful that we always look back and say, okay, well, what's the end game here? It's performance. So if I'm doing mechanistic stuff, what's the steps where this mechanistic work has a practical implication?
Do you think we're too quickly, as those that are working, I'm talking on behalf of those that are working in elite sport, to look at some research and go, no, it doesn't apply to me, it's in collegiate athletes, so I'm going to dismiss that completely. It's not with elite athletes, so not interested. Or should I be looking at that and thinking, okay, that's not exactly my population, but it's got something about it that then I can actually transfer to mine and have a little look myself, my own mini research study? Yeah. Do you think we're quite guilty of that, of just dismissing?
Oh, we can be, and I put myself in that category again. I wouldn't say, everybody else, but not me. I mean, I do that as well. And I think when you're in high performance sport, you just got to get it done. You're under pressure. You're worried about if we lose 3 more games these next weekends, I'm gone.
Yeah.
So we've got to put our realistic hat on here. And I always love, a very good colleague of mine, Aaron Coots, who you've had on the show. Coots, he talks about thinking fast and slow, and geez, it's a great analogy for the coach versus the scientist. But I think that the best ones I've seen in each field, if they are separate, have some characteristics of the other. They're a bit more hybrid rather than, off in one category or the other. And I've been influenced in that thinking from a very early stage by my time at the AIS. I was working with guys who were in physiology at the time, absolute, world leaders of, Louise Burke, a dietitian who people would know of, David Martin, David Pine, people like that who are just world-renowned sports scientists. But for them, it was all about, well, what's the practical implication of the work that they were doing? So, I guess a long way of saying integration's everything. If they're separate, I think we've got a massive problem.
Yeah, and we spoke about Jason Webber, who came on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, and he epitomised it. You look at him and you go, pure strength coach. That's just maybe the perception that people may have of him. You actually speak to him, and he's learning code. He's got this huge scientific underpinning that just sits him bang in the middle. I know his trade is as a strength coach, a strength and conditioning coach, but huge influence from what may be classed as the sports scientist.
Oh, completely. And, in my experience, people like Jason and many others around the place that are, the best at what they do sit right in the middle there. And they take a scientific approach, but then there's other times where they say, this is an art of coaching decision, away I go. And, that's an expert coach or expert sports scientist. So I fear for the people who understandably have spent the last few years behind a desk just downloading GPS units and coding up a report. I worry about where those people are going to go if they haven't, got their hands dirty at the coaching coalface. So, hopefully they get the opportunity to do that, before, those roles are sort of absorbed into other people's roles.
Yeah. So with all that said, how do you then not filter, but I suppose funnel people with your high performance online qualification based on what we just discussed? Do you push people down the more generalist route of like you say, sit in the middle? I guess that's maybe why you've called it high performance rather than a sports science or training condition. Okay. So you So you try to hit both aspects.
Oh, look, absolutely. And you've hit the nail on the head. For us, that was a very deliberate decision to call it a Master of High Performance Sport, because it's about the broad range of things that are important to be successful in that environment. And that includes, for example, a unit on leadership and culture. So, those things that, we often hear them referred to as soft skills, absolutely critical. And, we from time to time get people external to our program who will say, oh, well, what's the point of students doing that? They need to go out and get coaching experience. We couldn't agree more. Of course they do. But our view would be, well, you need to develop those skill sets, equally, either in parallel, or one might go before the other, or, like me, I'd been coaching for a long, long time before I decided to go and do a PhD. But ultimately, over time, you develop multiple skill sets and you hopefully become a bit more of a complete package. So in our program, yes, we're teaching people some underlying theoretical components, but it's always with the view to, okay, well, how do you apply this? What's the importance of the context of your environment, and encouraging them to, we have an internship unit, for example. So, right, go out and get your hands dirty as much as you can, so that you can learn for yourself how to apply these concepts that you're learning about.
Yeah, I listened to Jason's episode again the other night, and I was picking out little bits to put on social media and stuff. And one bit that I picked out was him saying, if you're a developing coach, just coach anyone. Don't care who it is, kids, old guys, middle-aged women, doesn't matter. Just get your hands on someone and just have that experience of dealing with them, generally dealing with people, their expectations, obviously the programming side as well. Just get as much experience as possible with anyone.
Look, I couldn't agree more. And it's really fascinating because you talk to a lot of up-and-coming young S&Cs, or again, sports scientists, however you want to refer to them, and they've got their heart set on working in a particular league, in a particular sport. And that's a wonderful aspiration. But I would say that, almost to a person, the ones who end up being more successful in those environments have been in multiple environments that are quite different prior to that, big gig that they really have coveted for a long time. And I know for a fact that my time at the Australian Institute of Sport, where I was a developing coach, and I worked with the men's and women's Olympic soccer team. I worked with the men's water polo team. I worked with rowing. I worked with judo. I helped other S&C coaches with men's and women's volleyball, basketball, netball. I mean, I learned so much that I could then take and apply to the single sport environment that I think Jason's point's spot on. That breadth of coaching experience is absolutely critical. But alongside that breadth of coaching experience, in my mind anyway, that's just as important is, understand the underlying, physiology, biomechanics, the mechanisms that drive adaptation and performance. So then you can really marry that with your coaching skills. And to me, then you've got a real high quality practitioner.
Mm-hmm. So let's dive back into the science and your experience in this area and the load fatigue relationship. I suppose it goes back into the mechanistic stuff. Just to go back, actually, I don't apologise for bringing that up about the coaching, because it has come up quite a bit, and people who listen regularly may think, he's always going about this, but I do think it has to be emphasised that any coaching, especially if they're developing coach, is good. But anyway,
completely. I mean, you're right to completely bring it up all the time because it's actually a thing, and it's what, sadly I'm at that point now where I'm the old guy who says back in my day. but stuff's changed, and what we would say is that let's not forget this other stuff, because it's about the totality of the skill set that you can bring to the program.
Mm-hmm. So little rant over for both of us.
I'm with you. I'm on your side.
But load fatigue relationship, and give us a bit of an overview of your work in this area, then we'll dive a little bit deeper again.
Yeah. Well, look, it's really funny how the planets line up, and I've been really fortunate. I think they've lined up a few times, and when I was at the AIS, one of the squads I was working with was the Matildas, which is the Australian women's soccer team, and we were preparing for the Sydney Olympic Games. So it was a great role. Fantastic head coach at the time, a guy called Chris Tansey, who actually played for Liverpool many years ago. And Chris was incredibly supportive of my role in the program. And at that time, I was completing my master's through the University of Canberra, and I was examining the strength and power of those athletes in that squad at sort of 3 time points in the 12-month lead up to the Olympics. And the first 2 testing occasions had just gone beautifully. And then, wouldn't you know it, about 3 days prior to the 3rd testing occasion, Chris, which was very unlike him, he's had enough. They're not doing what he wants, and he smashed them. He absolutely flogged them. Now, I'm not saying they didn't deserve it, but that's what happened. So I've said, you beauty, I'm just about to do lower body strength and power profile on these girls. What's going to happen? Anyway, I went through with the testing, not knowing what I was going to get. You got what you got. And as I was analysing my data, I thought, geez, some of these lower body explosive qualities are really suppressed. Of course, it wasn't too hard to link the previous training to that outcome. So that kind of ignited in me this idea of the response to a given load and how you might assess it. So, moved from the AIS, and then after I'd been at West Coast for sort of 4 or 5 years, I spoke to Mike McGuigan and Rob Newton about a PhD, and we explored those ideas in the Australian Footy League.
So Chris did you a favour there by smashing them.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I owe him my whole career, to be honest. Yeah, but again, that's where I say the planets line up. If that doesn't happen, maybe I don't, have the light bulb and put 2 and 2 together. So, been really fortunate at the time that those kind of things just came along.
So let's dive a little bit deeper into that area a bit more, and individual differences, and in terms of how one person maybe react to a certain amount of load, and how that response is showing fatigue. Just dive a little bit deeper into that if we can.
Yeah, well, I guess ultimately we're interested in the individual response, aren't we? And it's all about the individual response to a given load rather than the given load itself. And what we've sort of been able to establish is that really it's that individual perception or objective assessment of the experienced load that's important. So it's the response to that load rather than the load itself. And I think a really interesting thing that's starting to come out now, and Rich Johnson, who's at ACU, Rich, fantastic operator, and Paul Tafari, also at ACU, who's recently finished his PhD. I was lucky enough to work with him as a supervisor, and both those guys have done some work which is showing pretty clearly that that fatigue response to a given load can be mediated by physical capacity. E.g., if you're fitter and stronger, you tolerate that external load, much better. So your individual response to that is less negative than those athletes that aren't as well conditioned. So it's all about the individual response.
So in terms of measuring that fatigue in the applied world, what options have we got?
Yeah, well, it's an area that I'm super interested in, and I guess you can really classify it into 2 broad approaches. You can look at it objectively or subjectively. What's really interesting to me is that, I think we often view the subjective approach as perhaps the poor cousin of the objective measure. But the more you investigate, the more I think you can easily justify it's in fact the gold standard. There's a really nice paper in MedSci from 2016, Anoka and Dushitu, and they talk about translating, I've got it, Translating Fatigue to Human Performance is the title of the paper. And they make the case that really, fatigue as a symptom, if you want to call it that, represents either as a state or a trait, so something that's more transient or something that might exist, more completely. And they make the really good argument that you can actually only measure that by definition through self-report. So that to me is a really strong argument for the use of the subjective assessment of fatigue. And so therefore the use of the validated questionnaires, DALDA, Rescue Sport, etc., really come into play. Also the the more common wellness questionnaires that we all use and are adapted, but I'll put a little rider on that because of, even though practically use it all the time, we've done plenty of work which to me suggests some real ecological validity for that approach. There's some question about whether the scales and the wording, etc., really meet the level of rigour that those other types of more validated psychometric scales have. So, with a slight word of caution, but from a usability perspective, really valuable. If we think about the objective side, I suppose that's where I really developed my interest with using a counter movement jump as a representation of neuromuscular fatigue. And I sort of went about it backwards. Instead of starting in the lab, measuring that underlying really clear neuromuscular fatigue that we could identify the source of, sort of went the other way. And so through that process we were discussing earlier, decided that through some fairly, I'd like to think rigorous analysis, that one variable, that being the ratio of flight time to contraction time, was the most sensitive and useful variable in AFL football. I've got to point out I've never suggested that automatically then applies in other environments, because I think you've got to do that work. But funnily enough, we've certainly shown it in A-League soccer, and I know other people have been using that metric or similar ones. I think the message is that it tends to be those variables that reflect a change in strategy rather than simply an output. So the athlete will find a way, in inverted commas, to achieve a certain output. And so by measuring the strategy, you can see what's changed in order to achieve that given output. And that might be reflective of neuromuscular fatigue. Obviously, in the field, that works. Now, it's not the gold standard because that's in the lab with a dynamometer, and it's an isometric contraction and a superimposed magnetic or electrical stimulation over the top of that voluntary contraction to look at aspects of central and peripheral fatigue. Of course, that doesn't work. But as I said, the thing that we've done with Paul Tafari's work is actually go back into the lab and assess the impact of team sport performance on that gold standard way of measuring neuromuscular fatigue. So it's interesting to go back and really understand the mechanism. The comment that I would like to make about measuring fatigue in high-performance sport is I think you've got to consider it from two ends. For the measure to be valid, and this is just my musings here, it has to respond in a particular way to a given load, and there should be a dose-response relationship. So if you do more of X, then the variable should respond accordingly. But the other thing, which I reckon is probably even more important, is that if I have a variable that responds to a previous load, and let's say it's suppressed, but then I undertake my next performance and this variable's still suppressed, but it has no impact on my subsequent performance, I probably actually don't care that it's suppressed because it kind of happens, but it's not really impacting anything. So I think one of the real steps in the ecological validation of these measures of fatigue is that if they're suppressed or elevated or whatever direction for that variable, it's got to show up in something like the activity profile of the subsequent event. Or to me, it's a bit questionable about, well, it changed, but zero influence. Mm-hmm. So for me, in practice, number one, get the subjective assessment of fatigue. And if you're going down the objective line, I think you've got to be really clear of the impact of load on that variable to demonstrate which one's most sensitive. And then critically, okay, well, does that suppression or whatever variation impact subsequent performance in order to tick the boxes from both ends of the equation? And, then if you've got a combination of objective and subjective measures, I think you've got a reasonable system.
Mm-hmm. So one thing I'll just ask you, just before I let you go, is about submax runs that are getting reasonably popular out there in the field.
Yeah.
Is that something that, I know you've done, students have done work in this area, is that something that you're seeing a big rise in for this reason?
Yeah, exactly right, Rob. I think it's really attractive to people because they're able to perhaps utilise a protocol that they were going to do anyway, that fits in within a standard small-sided game that's done regularly or perhaps part of a warm-up. And I guess really the start of this type of approach was using heart rate recovery and heart rate variability from submax tests. And there's now multiple groups have examined this type of thing, looking at everything from heart rate through to changes in accelerometer metrics. And the work we did with Amber Rowell was using a small-sided game and having a look at the change in accelerometer load and how that lined up with what we found with fatigue as identified through flight time to contraction time ratio in the counter movement jump. And it's fascinating to me that we found pretty much the same thing as we found in AFL footy, and that is a reduction in the vertical vector of the accelerometer when you're in a fatigued state. And that may well represent a reduction in stiffness. Mechanistically, that makes sense. That's what it might be, but we've yet to quantify that, although we're heading down that path at the moment to look at that in some more detail. But I think standardised protocols that are within a program mean that people might be a little more likely to buy into performing them, but they're not without their limitations.
Mm-hmm. Back to the invisible monitoring phrase.
Yeah, invisible monitoring.
There anyway.
Yeah, that's right. I guess the one thing that's a slight challenge potentially with them is if you perform some sort of fatigue monitoring protocol and it's well prior to training, let's say in the hour before the players get out onto the training ground, you might be able to have some intervention or talk to the coach about some change in the plan for an individual athlete. But if you're doing a standardised protocol, let's say it's part of a warm-up, it's really invisible and it's not invasive, but you might be left with the challenge of a really late decision having to be made about the status of an athlete. Now, that might be fine. Everything's a trade-off, isn't it? And some coaches might cope really well with that. I've known one or two who perhaps wouldn't deal with a late notice quite so well.
Yeah, amazing. Well, I know I've kept you for an hour now, so anyone that wants to catch up with you on any of this and anything else for that matter, where's the best place for people to catch up?
Yeah, no, look, it's been great to chat to you. My Twitter handle's at Stu Cormack. So, yeah, please just follow and or send me a message and I'll get an alert that someone's mentioned me and I'll follow up. Happy to do that. Or my email, easily, you can track me down through ACU, but it's stuart.cormack@acu.edu.au.
Superb. Well, thank you very much for your time, Stu. Really appreciate you coming on and, apologies for the stalking for a while, but really appreciate you coming on and having a chat.
No, look, Rob, it's been a pleasure and really flattered to be invited and hopefully it's of interest to people. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Stu. Pleasure.
Good on you, Rob.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Pacey Performance Podcast. I hope you enjoyed the chat with Stu. So big thanks to sponsors Hawking Dynamics, iMeasureU, Black Box Fitness and Kitman Labs for sponsoring this episode today. The podcast could not run in its current form without these guys, so if you are in the market for force plates, inertial sensors, an AMS or gym equipment, definitely check these guys out. Also, big thanks to Stu for giving up his time. I know it's a strange time we're all living in now, and this was recorded in the midst of that, but super busy guy, obviously taking things online, so really appreciate him giving up his time to have a little chat. So thank you for tuning in again, thank you for your support, and I will chat to you next week.